On March 29, 2022, at Westminster Abbey, the cameras caught something that stopped the country cold. Queen Elizabeth II, 95 years old, leaning on a walking stick, arrived at Prince Philip's memorial service, not on the arm of Charles, not on the arm of William, but escorted down the aisle by her second son, Prince Andrew, a man who 6 weeks earlier had settled a civil sexual assault lawsuit for an undisclosed sum rather than face a jury. The palace had provided a program to the press under embargo. Andrew's name wasn't on it. His appearance was a deliberate deviation from the planned schedule, personal, unilateral, and unmistakable in its meaning. She chose him. On the most public day of grief the royal family had faced since Diana's funeral, the Queen of England put her hand on Andrew's arm and walked toward the altar. She had spent the previous 2 years systematically dismantling his official life to protect the crown. She had stripped his military titles, his royal patronages, his right to be called His Royal Highness in an official capacity. She had done everything a monarch could do to separate institution from man. And then, in the nave of Westminster Abbey, she made clear that none of it had changed what he was to her. He was her son, her favorite son, and she was going to walk into that church on his arm, and the world could make of it whatever it liked. This isn't a story about Andrew's guilt, nor about Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. It's a story about a woman of extraordinary discipline and institutional intelligence who had one blind spot and spent 70 years of a reign never being able to fully close it. Because the blind spot had a name and a birthday and a particular way of making her laugh. Queen Elizabeth II was undone not by politics or scandal, but by the oldest human weakness. A mother's love for a child she likely knew on some level didn't deserve it. Prince Andrew Albert Christian Edward Mountbatten-Windsor was born at 3:30 in the afternoon on February 19, 1960, at Buckingham Palace. He was the first child born to a reigning British monarch since Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, in 1857. That detail alone tells you how his birth was received, not as an ordinary royal event, but as something closer to a renewal. By 1960, Elizabeth had been on the throne for 7 years. The frantic early period, Churchill, the Commonwealth contractions, the establishing of every protocol a young queen inherits overnight, was behind her. When Andrew arrived, she was, for the first time, a monarch who could also afford to be a mother. Charles and Anne had received duty first. Andrew got what they hadn't: more of her time, more of her attention, more of herself. Royal historian Robert Lacey has said it was the Queen who insisted on a second round of children, a deliberate personal choice rather than dynastic necessity. Andrew arrived 12 years after Charles. Palace accounts associated his birth with a revitalization of her marriage to Philip, a happy domestic chapter in a life otherwise structured by obligation. She loved him with a different intensity than the others, the intensity of a woman who had finally learned what it cost to be absent. The Queen made time for those children, one royal source told the press. She would arrive at Andrew's school sometimes with a single bodyguard, driving herself. She attended sports days and school matches. These weren't the gestures of an absent monarch performing motherhood. They were the instincts of a woman correcting her own record. Tina Brown, whose 2022 book, The Palace Papers, drew on more than 120 royal insiders, described how Andrew always received much more of Elizabeth's attention than any of his siblings. Philip saw his second son as a natural boss, hardy, robust, physically confident in ways that Charles wasn't. Andrew was undaunted by his father's severity. He absorbed it and bounced back, where Charles had been shaped and scarred by it. In that difference, Andrew won something from both parents that Charles never quite managed: uncomplicated approval. The same confidence that charmed his parents was already cutting the people around him. By the time Andrew reached Gordonston, his classmates found him, in Brown's words, big-headed, arrogant, and deluded about his own intelligence. He told off-color jokes and laughed loudest at his own. He was a boy who had never been told he was wrong by the people whose opinion mattered most. And then came the Falklands, and everything hardened into legend. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982. HMS Invincible was one of only 2 operational aircraft carriers available to the Royal Navy, and Prince Andrew was aboard her as a Sea King helicopter co-pilot. He was 22. The cabinet was apprehensive from day one. The prospect of a queen's son being killed in combat carried implications no government wanted to manage. There were moves to reassign him to a desk role. The queen refused. He would stay with his ship. That decision is a window into how she thought about Andrew. He wasn't to be protected from this consequence, not the kind that applied to every other serviceman. She wanted him treated as what he was, a Royal Navy officer doing his job. He flew anti-submarine missions, exocet missile decoy operations, casualty evacuations. He witnessed the Argentine attack on the SS Atlantic conveyor. Commander Nigel Ward's memoir, Sea Harrier over the Falklands, described him as an excellent pilot and a very promising officer. When HMS Invincible returned to Portsmouth on September 17, 1982, the Queen, Prince Philip, and Princess Anne boarded the carrier far out in the harbor, the first Royal Navy vessel to fly the Royal Standard since 1948. Andrew walked down the gangplank with a red rose between his teeth. The Queen pulled out a camera and photographed the scene like any other proud mother at the dockside. Royal expert Katie Nicholl described what the Falklands did to the family dynamic. Andrew came back a hero and was very much the golden boy of the royal family. The imbalance predated the war by 22 years, but the Falklands calcified it. He had risked his life. She had let him risk it. Between them, that created a debt of pride so deep it functioned almost like immunity. Immunity, when it's never tested, becomes something else entirely. Tina Brown wrote that one senses there was always a hollowness in Andrew's personality. That's why he laughed louder and boasted so much and tried to seem important. By the time he went to Gordonston, he knew that for all the palaces he lived in and the servants who served him, he was the second son whose childhood parody with Charles was a mirage. A man protected from consequence by a mother's love, whose arrogance is never corrected because the person with the authority to correct it can't see it, does not develop judgment. He develops entitlement. The record on Andrew bears this out with a kind of relentless specificity. Biographer Andrew Lowney documents him calling a royal staff member a fucking imbecile for failing to give the Queen Mother her full title, dismissing an employee for wearing a nylon tie, and asking his security detail to retrieve his golf balls. Andrew was appointed the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment in 2001. Charles had opposed the appointment from the start, telling the Queen that his brother lacked the diplomatic experience and temperament the role required. The Queen insisted anyway. Royal biographer Robert Jobson has said Charles was left thinking, "I told you so," when the trade envoy role ended in humiliation in July 2011. By then, far worse was already accumulating. Jeffrey Epstein entered Andrew's orbit in 1999, introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell, who had been a close friend of Andrew's for years. Andrew would later claim on Newsnight that he first met Epstein that year, though his own private secretary had said in 2011 that the pair met in the early 1990s, and Lowney's research indicates both Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah had known Epstein before 1999. What followed wasn't a discreet friendship conducted in private. In the summer of 1999, Epstein and Maxwell vacationed at Balmoral. A photograph of the pair there was found among Epstein's possessions in his Manhattan mansion and entered as evidence during Maxwell's 2021 trial. In February 2000, Epstein was with Andrew at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago Club in Florida. In June 2000, Epstein and Maxwell attended a party at Windsor Castle, hosted by Queen Elizabeth II herself, celebrating Andrew's 40th birthday, alongside the Princess Royal's 50th, the Queen Mother's 100th, and Princess Margaret's 70th. That December, Epstein joined Andrew at a shooting weekend at Sandringham, the royal family's Norfolk estate. Epstein wasn't an acquaintance glimpsed at a charity function. He was a guest at Balmoral. He was on the Windsor Castle invitation list at a party the Queen hosted. He spent weekends at Sandringham. The household staff, the security detail, the protection officers whose professional function was to monitor who moved through these spaces. They all saw him. What the Queen was personally told, and when, remains formally undocumented. The palace has never commented on any internal briefing about Epstein's activities. But in June 2006, when Epstein attended festivities at Andrew's Windsor residence ahead of Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday celebrations, a U.S. arrest warrant had already been issued for Epstein for the sexual assault of a minor. Epstein was arrested by Florida police 8 days after that party. Andrew later said he had no knowledge of the warrant. Epstein pleaded guilty in 2008 to procuring a minor for prostitution and served 13 months under a plea deal that federal prosecutors would later describe as unconscionably lenient. Andrew's response was to visit Epstein in New York in 2010, after the conviction, after the prison sentence, after the registration as a sex offender. He later called it a mistake. Epstein reportedly described Andrew to others as an idiot, but a useful one. The information was in the air the royal household breathed, year after year, residence after residence. The question of what Elizabeth knew is ultimately unanswerable in the legal sense. The question of what she could have known, given what moved through her houses, isn't. Jeffrey Epstein died in a New York prison cell in August 2019, awaiting federal sex trafficking charges. His death should have closed the chapter. Instead, it opened the worst one. That November, Andrew and his communications team made a decision that remains, in the annals of modern public relations, genuinely inexplicable. They offered the BBC's Newsnight program an interview. Producer Sam McAllister had led a year of negotiations to secure it, and it was, according to subsequent reporting, offered up blithely by the prince's PR crew without any sense of legal implications. Emily Maitlis, the Newsnight presenter who conducted the interview, later stated publicly that the Queen had given her approval for Andrew to sit for it. The interview was filmed on November 14, 2019, inside Buckingham Palace. It aired 2 days later, and within hours had become a masterclass in self-destruction. Andrew denied having met Virginia Giuffre, despite a photograph showing them together in London in 2001, when she was 17. He offered 2 explanations for why the photograph couldn't be authentic: a medical condition that meant he couldn't sweat, and the specific alibi that on the night in question, he had taken his daughter to a Pizza Express in Woking. He expressed no empathy for Epstein's victims. When asked directly whether he regretted the friendship, he said he didn't, stating that, "The people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn either by him or because of him were actually very useful." The public reaction was immediate and total. Corporate sponsors began withdrawing from Andrew's charitable patronages within 24 hours. Outward Bound, Huddersfield University, and major corporate sponsors including KPMG, AstraZeneca, and Standard Chartered issued statements of distance. Armed Forces associations, organizations that had stood by Andrew as a Falklands veteran, followed. 4 days after the interview aired, on November 20, 2019, a statement was issued in Andrew's name. It has become clear to me over the last few days that the circumstances relating to my former association with Jeffrey Epstein has become a major disruption to my family's work and the valuable work going on in the many organizations and charities that I am proud to support. He was stepping back from public duties. The statement was the Queen's mechanism as much as Andrew's words. Senior aides and the Prince of Wales had advised the Queen that Andrew should be withdrawn. He was withdrawn. The statement contained something conspicuous in its absence: no apology to victims, no acknowledgement that the concerns raised were anything more than a disruption to the schedule. The institution moved. The mother didn't condemn. For 2 years, Andrew remained in a kind of protected limbo, stripped of public duties, but still a royal, still Elizabeth's son. On January 12, 2022, U.S. Federal Judge Lewis Kaplan rejected Andrew's motion to dismiss Virginia Giuffre's civil lawsuit. The legal argument his team had relied upon, that a 2009 settlement between Giuffre and Epstein had released Andrew from liability, was rejected. The case would proceed. 1 day later, on January 13, 2022, Buckingham Palace announced that Andrew had been stripped of his honorary military affiliations, his royal patronages, and his use of the His Royal Highness style in any official capacity. He would defend the lawsuit as a private citizen. The speed, 1 day between the judge's ruling and the palace statement, suggests the stripping of titles wasn't a decision made that week. It was a contingency, prepared and waiting for the legal trigger. Royal sources described the Queen as privately anguished by the decision. She signed off on it. She did, at 95, against the child she had insisted on having, whose courage in the Falklands she had defended against the cabinet, whom she had driven to school sports days with a single bodyguard. She did it because the institution and the men who would inherit it made it unavoidable. But the timing, waiting for the judge, tells you something about the order of her priorities. On February 15, 2022, a joint statement confirmed that Andrew and Virginia Giuffre had reached an out-of-court settlement. The financial terms weren't publicly disclosed, though reporting indicated the sum ran into the millions and included a substantial donation to Giuffre's charitable foundation. There was no admission of guilt. There was also no exoneration, and the public understood the distinction plainly enough. 6 weeks later, on March 29, 2022, the Queen arrived at Westminster Abbey on Andrew's arm. The palace had issued the program to the press under embargo. Andrew wasn't on it. His appearance at the Queen's side was a deliberate choice withheld from public disclosure until the moment it happened. The 95-year-old monarch, who at that point had been unable to attend the Commonwealth Day service and the Royal Maundy service due to mobility problems, walked into Philip's memorial on the arm of her most publicly disgraced son. Charles was there. William was there. The entire senior working royal family was present. She chose Andrew. Senior royals were said to be frustrated. The decision was described in reporting as the Queen's personal and unilateral call, taken despite objections from within the family. Royal commentators spent the days afterward trying to parse the symbolism. No one could quite explain it away. Tina Brown's summary remains the most precise verdict available. She protected him, and Mommy was his only client, essentially. She was the one who protected him, so unfortunately, it made him worse. Royal historian Sarah Gristwood framed it against the full arc of Elizabeth's motherhood. What we saw at the beginning of the Queen's reign, with Charles suffering from a mother who put her duty first, came full circle with Andrew. When push came to shove, she protected the institution. That is true. It's also incomplete, because at Westminster Abbey, she wasn't protecting the institution. The institution had already been protected, at Andrew's expense. What she was doing in that nave was something the institution couldn't reach: being a mother. She had been queen for 70 years. 15 prime ministers, the end of empire, Diana's death, the slow erosion of deference that had once kept the monarchy above scrutiny. She had held the crown together through catastrophes that should have finished it. She had reduced Charles's father to a consort, managed Margaret's heartbreaks as affairs of state, watched her eldest son's marriage collapse in public, and never once, in 7 decades, said publicly what she actually thought of the people around her. She did all of that, and she couldn't bring herself to abandon the son whose hollowness she had helped create, whose arrogance she had never corrected, whose deepening association with a convicted sex offender she had watched from inside the houses where that man appeared as a guest. There is a version of this story where Elizabeth simply didn't know the depth of it. In another, she knew and trusted Andrew's denials. In a third, she understood exactly what Andrew was, the entitled, reality-resistant man described in every royal biography, and loved him anyway, specifically because she had helped make him that way. Royal author Christopher Anderson said she loved Andrew to the very end, and that she did what she could to protect him. That protection began in 1960, when she decided to be present for this child in a way she hadn't managed for the first. It deepened in 1982, when she refused to remove him from a war zone. It survived the trade envoy fiasco, the Newsnight disaster, the lawsuit, the settlement, and the stripping of every title she had the formal power to strip. And then, 6 months before she died, she walked into Westminster Abbey on his arm. The most disciplined woman in British public life, a woman who had spent 7 decades subordinating personal feeling to institutional necessity, made one last fully human choice, in public, in the nave of the most watched church in England. Whether that was the most honest moment of her reign, the one time the crown dropped far enough to show the woman beneath it, or its most painful failure, depends entirely on what you believe a mother owes an institution, and what an institution owes the truth. She left the world the image, not the scepter, not the statement, not the stripped titles. The image is her hand on Andrew's arm. The image is a mother who saw what her son was and walked in anyway. Subscribe for more stories like this.